Did anybody grab the handouts?
No.
I don't know if they, well, I thought they had printed, but they weren't there. I'm going to try printing them one more time. Okay, they should be working now. Give it about 30 seconds. All right, I hope everybody could hear that. All right, so chapter 7. Hopefully we're going to get about half done this week. We'll finish the rest of it next week. Again, we're still in Carl Trueman's Strange New World. I think we have about 2 chapters left after this one. So I got to figure out what we're doing next for Sunday school. So if you have any suggestions or pressing issues, feel free to tell me, text me, email me, because I am starting to think about that. But anyways, and I'll need one of those too, if you don't mind. Thank you, sir. Really, the reason that I wanted to hand out this morning was that this final quote under point 2 is significant enough that I want everybody to have their eyes on it and see what's being argued. But anyway, so Trueman starts out the chapter, his introduction, by writing, "The letters LGBTQ+ loom large in the cultural and political imagination of our day. The coalition of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer people is without a doubt the greatest political success story of the last half century. In the 1960s, homosexuality was still illegal in many Western countries. Even Barack Obama did not dare to support gay marriage unequivocally until 2012. Yet today, even to voice dissent from trans ideology is likely to earn one a ferocious social media beating and exclusion from polite liberal society. The speed, depth, and comprehensive scope of the LGBTQ+ triumphant cultural conquest is impressive." Okay. And again, this is the greatest political success story of our time, and I think it's something to take note of. Given how impressive the triumph has been, I think it's really important we figure out how they did this. When you go to a military academy, or people that go to military academies, and people who teach the history of warfare, think of it in an American context, they don't just study all of our victories. How awesome we are as America. They tend to study. They also study, and even particularly study, our defeats. They just study, for instance, you go to an American war college today, you're going to study the Confederate victories and their spectacular victories over Union armies at times, because we want to learn from our enemies. We want to learn how we were beat in order for us to triumph in the future. That other people have good strategies too. And if we're just trusting in how smart we are in the history of how we've been doing things, that's not going to lead to good conclusions. For instance, the Chinese general and master strategist Sun Tzu, we think Sun Tzu lived sometime around the 6th or 5th centuries BC. So think roughly around the time of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Old Testament. Sun Tzu wrote, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat." What Trueman has been arguing, particularly in this chapter, but previously, is that conservatives and conservative Christians have not understood the enemy. They have not known the enemy. Well, people like us tend to think that since all this LGBTQ propaganda is out there, that it's loud and proud, that's just all over the airways and television, that it's obvious what's going on. That we think just by looking at the smoke and mirrors that we understand what this is. But Trueman says that what we're seeing is just more of an illusion or a mirage, that we have failed to peer beyond all the smoke and pomp to see that behind it all lies a rather pitiful figure who says, "Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain." There's nothing behind this. There's no solid ground. There's no comprehensive, unifying ideology other than, as Trueman has argued in that video, oppression and being in an oppressed class and unifying behind sort of a common enemy. But that's it. There's no grand intellectual ideology that they're going to claim there is, as we're going to read. There's nothing intellectual about it. It's all absurd, and we need to be able to recognize that. And these groups, these letters, they don't agree with one another. And in fact, They're inherently in opposition to one another. Behind the impressive array of companies, propaganda, and elite figures is a garbled mess of conflicting ideology. And again, we need to be able to point out what that ideology is, to identify it. When Jesus calls us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us, I think what goes on, that goes in one ear and it comes out the other, and the Christian thinks, I'm not supposed to have any enemies. I'm not supposed to be against anyone or opposed to anybody. That's not what Jesus said. If we're going to love our enemies, that assumes there is an enemy out there. There are people that are opposed to us. We're supposed to treat them in a certain way. The call to love our enemies is the call to know them. You can't love somebody if you don't know them or know something about them. And in knowing them, or in learning about them and getting to know them, building community with them, our hope is that they come to know the same God that we do. The Apostle Paul, for instance, he starts his missionary journeys in the Greco-Roman world. His attitude is not, he doesn't go in saying, well, I know my Bible. Paul probably had the Old Testament memorized. His attitude is not, I know my Bible, and that's all I need to know to talk to these people. That's the attitude of the average modern evangelical. All I need to know is my Bible. I don't need to know anything else. I don't need to know anything about history. I don't need to know anything about philosophy. I don't need to know anything about the worldview of the people I'm talking to. I just need to know my Bible, and that's it. I need to understand my position, and that's all I care about. I hear people saying things like that all the time, and that's why the average American evangelical is losing the cultural battle. Paul was an expert on the Greco-Romans. Paul understood the Greco-Romans probably better than the vast majority of them understood themselves. He could quote from memory the very best of their philosophers and poets because Paul believed that in order to reason with these crazy Greeks and Romans, and he probably thought they were crazy, that in order to talk to them, that he had to understand something about what they believed and what drove them to behave the way in which they did. Paul understood the underlying worldview and philosophies that drove the Greco-Romans to live in utterly sexually depraved lifestyles, and they wrote about it extensively, and history testifies to it extensively. Paul understood the sort of things that drove these things, and oftentimes a lot of these things are the things that drive our sexually depraved culture, though they've taken different forms today in terms of the ideology. Paul was also more than willing to call out the gays and lesbians as being depraved, as something that's, in Romans 1, he's talking to, this church in Rome. He doesn't appeal instantly or immediately to the law of Moses. He seems to elsewhere. In Romans 1, Paul appeals to natural law. Because that would have probably been a concept the Greco-Romans would have more readily understood and accepted, as opposed to appealing to the Old Testament, which most of them would never have read by this point, them being, for the most part, Gentiles who didn't grow up as Jews or in a synagogue. He appeals to other categories that would have been familiar to them and that would have been appealing to them in of themselves. But modern conservative Christians tend not to care, or they act like they don't care what makes the gays behave the way that they do. For every battle Christian conservatives win in this country, they lose another one because we have failed to know the enemy. To dismantle the unbelieving worldview, you have to know what it is that you're attacking if you're going to tear it down. I recently stumbled across, as I'm doom scrolling on Facebook at the end of the day, I recently stumbled across one of those deep fake short videos of RFK Jr. making a public announcement. Again, this is fake. This isn't real. It's clearly fake if you watch it. And that makes it even funnier, at least for me. He says, and this is probably the only context where it would be appropriate to say something like this in church. So here it goes. He says, I am declaring war on fat, gay kids. Not the kids themselves, but on whatever it is that is making them fat, gay, and pathetic. And so it's something like that with us, and what we're trying to do here today. And Truman said something like this in far more polite and church-like terminology, I guess. We're not declaring war on the gays themselves. We're declaring war on an ideology. Again, our battle is not with flesh and blood. We're declaring war on whatever it is that is making them gay. Because again, our general argument is they're going to say, well, this isn't a choice. I'm going to argue that these things are choices. A lot of them are socially conditioned. There's certain factors that have gone into this to make them behave the way they behave and feel the way they behave. We're declaring war on whatever it is that's making them gay, lost, and depraved. We have to figure out what's causing the problem. We have to know our enemy. The LGBTQ plus coalition is not nearly as stable as it seems. It's full of internal tensions and contradictions, and we have to understand what these tensions and contradictions are so we can exploit them and take them down on the day of battle. So that's what the rest of the lesson is about this morning. So that brings us to point 1 on the LGBTQ plus, a marriage of convenience. Truman writes, the first thing to note about the LGBTQ plus is that its different constituent members are actually divided over the very thing upon which an outsider might assume they are agreed, the nature and status of sex. So the acronym is relatively new. Of course, I've grown up with it, all of my life that I can remember, but there's even been modifications over my lifetime. And it's not at all obvious. So, Truman talks about the Stonewall riots that sort of kick off the movement, or at least it puts it in the public spotlight in the 1960s. But it's not at all 1960s. So if you're gay in the 1960s, it is, let's say especially you're a gay intellectual. You're somebody at one of these universities that's teaching critical theory, and you're trying to promote Marxist Freudianism. It's not at all obvious to you that these letters go together. And that seems rather shocking in hindsight to us, because now all the letters are together, and that's how we think of this. But it's not at all obvious for gay people in the 1960s that the L, the G, the B, the T, and the Q, or even the plus, that all of these things go together. It's not until the 1990s that you begin to see the T added in the acronym. So again, we're in the last 30 years. For some of us, it feels like the 90s or 20 years ago now, maybe 10 years ago. But anyways, it's not until the 1990s that the T begins to be widely included. And it's not really until the 2010s that you see the Q popping up a lot in the acronym. It's not like there's an official organization out there that puts the acronym together, but you see these things generally adopted. It's not till the 2010s till the Q and the plus begin to widely be included. And then you see some other letters get strung along at some points, but those have tended to be a failure. The plus, the Q, at first the Q was meant to cover everything else, and then they decided it didn't cover everything else. So now that's why you got a plus. But then, if it's just a plus sign, that's not really recognition. You have to recognize people particularly, so the plus is kind of offensive to some classes. So they feel like they need their own acronym. But if there can be an infinite number of sexualities, that causes a problem for the acronym, and it's harder to advertise your cause. So again, there's all sorts of problems here. But anyways, the union of the causes of the L's and the G's is what came first. And again, the L's and the G's came together really recently in the grand scheme of things. Really, until the 1980s, the typical view the lesbian theorist had was that the gay men enjoyed white privilege. Or they enjoyed male privilege. They also enjoyed white privilege too. Early on in the sexual revolution, the term gay, so in the 1960s, people are talking about the gays. That's a catch-all for all sexual deviants. It's just all the same thing. The American mind and what we would call the LGBT community and everybody else that's looking at this, that they're all gay. And that's how they would refer to themselves. But female homosexuals, really quickly, that they come to reject that term. They don't think it applies to them, or they don't want it to apply to them. But the reason being because they don't want to be associated with men. That's bad. These gay men, they're part of the oppressor class, and they don't want to have anything to do with them. That's why they adopt the terminology of lesbians. Because again, in terms of Marxist critical theory, and so lesbianism is really an offshoot of modern feminism that itself is Marxist. In terms of Marxist critical theory, gay men are part of the oppressor class because all men are oppressors. And so being gay doesn't magically erase that. Gay men are a part of the oppressor class that oppresses lesbians and women in general. That's just natural to their constitution as men. They can't help but be oppressors. In terms of the feminist or Marxist worldview, or Marxist feminism, men inherently oppress women. And then it makes it even worse in terms of the Marxist critical categories, that most gay men in the West are also white men. So that's another point against them. In terms of intersectionality, white gay men are about as evil. They might as well just be straight white men in the grand scheme of things, which is why, if you're looking at modern politics, that's Pete Buttigieg's biggest problem in terms of he's probably going to run for president as a gay white male. Because in terms of his constituents, his leftist camp, he might as well just be straight. And in some ways, he'd probably be better off if he declared himself as straight. He doesn't fit in the right categories.
You might explain intersectionality, how that gives you more right to speak and intersect more categories.
I think I have. Am I going to talk about that? Okay, at some point I was going to talk about this, but again, the argument, so this is the long and the short of it, as simply as possible. In terms of the intersectionality and the critical theorists, they're playing a great game of who has the most oppression points. And so you have all these overlapping categories and connections, and so, for instance, white male is about as bad as it gets. White males are inherently evil in terms of the intersectionality game. They have all the privilege points and none of the oppressed points. Being a woman makes you inherently oppressed, but if you're a white woman, you're almost up there with the white males. But then you become a lesbian white woman, and now you have some oppression points. And so it's this long gradient of who's winning the oppression game and who has the most categories. You're a Native American lesbian woman. Now you have a lot of oppression points, and you deserve to be elevated and things like this. Now you're a Native American Muslim lesbian woman, and so you have more oppressed. And so you're trying to win the game of who's the most oppressed. And if the most oppressed people, in terms of the critical worldview, the most oppressed people deserve the most empathy and support. The most intervention to elevate them from their oppressed status and attack the people that are inherently oppressing them. And again, as white people, you inherently oppress other people, is what they're saying. You can't help it. It's just the way things are. You don't have the right points on the scoreboard.
And that's a generalization of economic Marxism to just apply it to every social category too.
Yeah.
And trying to even everyone out. You're more oppressed than
So yeah, we're putting some people down. So we want to, for instance, you see this. There's going to be quotas, and there's been a lot of court cases over this. You have quotas at universities. They're going to cap the number of white males and Asian males that are allowed in, especially Asian males, because they tend to be way more successful than everybody else because they work a lot harder. And so because they work harder and they're successful, and they get into the universities, we have to cap the numbers of white Asian males, so we can allow some more transgender biological female, though that's going to be a problem if you say that. Native Americans, we have to let them in, even though their ACT score is an 18. They have to get into Harvard, so we can have some competition. It can be evened out with the white males and the Asian males. Everything has to be even, and you have to ignore all these other factors that seem to explain why some groups are more successful than others. You can't look at that. It's all about oppression, not about success. Okay, so here's the argument in terms of the lesbian theory and why they historically don't want to be associated with gay men. In the 1970s, a gay man in the office, perhaps he's closeted, perhaps not, he doesn't really, in terms of most things, he doesn't behave any differently at the office than any of his coworkers. He shows up wearing a suit and tie, just like everyone else. Unlike his female coworkers, he doesn't have to make himself attractive to impress the boss. His chosen sexuality doesn't really necessitate him doing anything different than his other male colleagues who enjoy male privilege. That's not complete. You might. There are situations where you can argue that there are certain unfair advantages in one sense to being a male as opposed to a female in an office place. There's a lot of sexism out there. There is a lot of real bias. But I mean, it's inherent. It doesn't matter who you are in terms of the critical the system is just like this, and it's the way it is, and it doesn't matter what you think or believe or how you personally act or behave. You white people, especially you white males, are inherently oppressors no matter what. But the lesbian in the 70s office, she's in an entirely different boat. She may feel that her sexuality necessitates her to dress in masculine clothes, because remember, the goal of feminism, and this is our great critique of this, and many people have pointed this out, the goal of feminism is for women to be like men. That they think there's something inherently deficient about femininity, and so the goal is to be masculine. Which is hilarious if you start thinking about it. But anyway, so the lesbian wants to wear a suit and tie to prove that she's no different than her male colleagues. She can dress just like them, but dressing in a suit and tie is not the way to impress your male boss. And so what ends up happening is he promotes your female colleagues who dress up all cutesy and they wear makeup. And so the lesbian has faced discrimination because she has refused to conform to her gender's stereotypical dress. And again, in practice, you would see things like this. And perhaps still see them today. And there's other differences between the group. For gay men, being gay is mostly about the sexual activity itself. For most lesbian women, being a lesbian is mostly about the affection and companionship and camaraderie against the patriarchy. That's what being a lesbian is all about. It's not as much about the sex as it is for the gay man, which isn't surprising at all if you think about it. Well, what ended up uniting the L's and the G's is the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. Okay? So again, in the mind of the critical theorist, there's this big oppression game going on where you can earn more points in the oppression category and you can get elevated into a group that deserves more empathy, that deserves more support as opposed to other groups that should be handicapped. The AIDS crisis gives the gays a lot of points in the oppression game. As a surprise to literally no one, the AIDS crisis disproportionately affected gay men. But again, it's wrong. This is what the culture says. It's wrong to draw a connection between their sexual behavior and the consequences of their behavior. That would be bigoted, hateful to suggest the reason they're getting AIDS is because they're having unprotected sex with dozens of different partners over the years. It's wrong to suggest there's a connection between that and their disease. You have to unreservedly empathize with them as victims by no fault of their own. It'd be wrong for you to suggest that they've done something that's caused this and caused it to spread. And you'll also have major gay celebrities with AIDS, people like Freddie Mercury, that are promoting the cause to white audiences. The gay community goes from being viewed as part of the white male oppressor class to being viewed as a marginalized and oppressed class that is oppressed on account of their sexually expressive identity. That they're disproportionately getting AIDS because of their sexual identity, not because of their sexual behavior, but just because they're gay. Yes, sir?
So in the video, he was saying that the common enemy was the white heterosexual male. And then you yourself said that the oppressor class is the white heterosexual male as well as the Asian male.
Yeah, there's a gradient.
But
so they might put white males at the top. Asian males might be a little oppressed, but since they're above everybody else, they're inherently oppressing everybody else too.
But I think it's interesting that in societies where men are weak, which is in the white heterosexual male and the Asian male society, that's where these movements are able to take hold, because you really don't see the LGBTQ plus movement taking hold in other societies, other people groups, other nations, as well as it does where you have weak men.
Yeah, so some of what's going on is, this ideology gets promoted. You tell the teenage white male, you're part of the oppressor class. You need to be more empathetic towards these oppressed gay people with AIDS who have AIDS by no fault of their own. And so what's going on in their mind? It's like, oh, I'm a terrible person by virtue of who I am. I need to do more. And maybe I can do more by becoming part of the oppressed class. I'm going to over-empathize with them. I'm going to go down into the ranks of oppression with them. And by becoming them, by becoming gay, I can alleviate some of my problems that are inherent by me being a white male. Cancel it out a little bit. You're still an oppressor because you're white and a male, but at least now you're gay, and so you're helping to promote the cause. I think that's part of what's going on. And in terms of other groups, like African Americans are, all sorts of studies have they still demonstrate this. African Americans are overwhelmingly anti-gay in terms of their community. You are going to be very ostracized. And that's a problem because African Americans are supposed to be in a very oppressed class, and so that they should have camaraderie with gay people because they're also an oppressed class, but African Americans don't see them as themselves belonging to that oppressed class of gays, even though the liberals want to lump it all together. But that's not how it works in practice. But yeah, it's a good point. It's weakness.
In such a society, in their mind, some oppressing class that's more prominent there, it invites them to come in and want to make change. And it seems like, even though, and you'll get to this, I'm sure, but even though there's inherent contradictions between each letter, they're probably just amassing together for political, if we can just get along and all vote together, then.
And it's what Truman says, it's uniting against a common enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And again, I think he made a great point. Why is the coalition seeming to dissipate? It's because the enemy, us conservatives, aren't really putting up a fight anymore. That if we made more of an effort, if we put up more of a united front to call out the LGBTQ movement as what it is, as depraved and awful and as terrible for society, that would probably cause the LGBT movement to come together more to fight back. But it's falling apart because we're not doing enough. We're no longer a threat in the same way that we might have been 50 years ago. All right, so now that the gays they're no longer just seen in the same category as white males. Now they're seen as more of an oppressed class because of AIDS, and the empathetic lesbians go in on this hook, line, and sinker. The lesbians now see the gays as belonging to the same group that is oppressed by heteronormative patriarchal society. From then on out, the L's and the G's are united in a campaign for public acceptance of homosexuals and for the promotion of sex education that promotes their newly unified agenda. By the early 90s, the B's are included, the bisexuals are included in the mix. So now you have the LGB or GLB propaganda in the mainstream. So if you go back and look at the sex education material, the posters, the propaganda, those are the acronyms you're seeing, the three letters, LGB or GLB. Once they've decided that they're in the same sexually oppressed boat, their intellectuals and theorists take the time to posit, well, what other things unite us as a movement? Because previously they were talking about the things that separated them and the reasons they shouldn't be together, but now we're in the same boat, so we have to come up with reasons to be in the same boat. Just besides the AIDS crisis, the L's and the G's and the B's assume the importance of biological sex. Gay men are biological men who are attracted to other biological men. Lesbian women are biological women who are attracted to other biological women. And bisexuals are people who acknowledge their own biological sex while also being attracted to either member of the sex binary. And it's important that for them that there is a sex binary. It's directly related to the name bi, as in two sexes. So the sex binary of male and female is essential in the historic understanding of what it means to be a member of the L, the G's, and the B's. That there's men and there's women, and these things do not change. But the L's sacrifice something when they join with the G's and the B's. It's not just that lesbians are historically attracted to members of the same biological sex, but historically they assume that there are real class differences between men and women that typically lead or inherently lead to women being oppressed by men. This is very important for their theory of who they are and what they stand for. By allying themselves with the gays and the bisexuals, they have now downplayed or even denied that there are real differences between men and women and how they operate in the world. This then paves the way for the inclusion of the T and the Q into the alliance, and that brings us to point two. Trans ideology. Truman thinks, and he's argued this, we've already talked about it, that the origins of trans ideology go back to the 19th century. Marx and Engels, think the Communist Manifesto and their other popular writings, so they argue the new machinery in factories allows for women to do the same jobs as men, thus shrinking the differences between men and women. Again, Marx initially posits that there's a class of men and a class of women. These things are different, that women are more historically oppressed. He doesn't go as far as the modern gender theorist, but he sees that dynamic too, and he outlines that. And so what the modern factories now do, that they allow women to be elevated to become just like men. That's very important for the Marxist. And again, Marx and Engels, if they had seen where this had taken off to, and then this trans ideology stuff, that they would have been rather horrified to discover that their ideology produced something like Caitlyn or Bruce Jenner. In Marx's world, Caitlyn or Bruce would have been sent to the re-education camps because his behavior, her behavior is antisocial. It's not good for society. Or, Bruce or Caitlyn would have been summarily executed for a mental deficiency because, the state shouldn't have to bear the burden of these crazy people who are confused about their gender. That's what Marx would have done. Nonetheless, Marx and Engels lay the foundation for technology to remove the differences between men and women. The 19th century also sees the contribution of Nietzsche's death of God. God is dead and we've killed him. And so now the result of that is everybody is their own God and thus their own self-creator. We're all artists now, or we all ought to be artists in Nietzsche's worldview. The will to power, Nietzsche's grand concept, is the will to become whatever you want to become, particularly in abandoning what you are now. Nietzsche says you're weak if you stay where you are, if you just let society form you. The will to power is abandoning what you are, to cross over and to overcome and to become something of your own making that is free and true to yourself. That if you're not creating yourself, you're not being true to yourself, you're just letting society govern you, you're just a sheep. And Freud contributes to the mix by making human identity entirely psychological in a way that is divorced from physical reality. The psyche is now viewed as something that can be conditioned and changed in ways that were never thought possible. These things taken together, once they enter the cultural imagination, now cause people to see the physical body as something that's incidental rather than essential. And anything the body lacks for whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish can be overcome through technology, and you ought to overcome it if you are to be your own creator and thus true to yourselves. These things coalesce in the literature of the 1949 work of the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, which I have the quote on your handout. In her book, The Second Sex, and this is where you really see trans ideology become part of the literature, this is what she writes. One is not born, but rather becomes woman. No biological, psychic, or economic destinies defines the figure that the human female takes on in society. It is civilization as a whole that elaborates this intermediary product between male and the eunuch that is called feminine. Okay, that's a very, very, very strange thing to say. But again, this is sort of the basis of modern trans ideology. So we ought to reflect on what she's trying to say. Again, she's saying the feminine is an intermediary product between the male and the eunuch. So what she's saying is that femininity is inherently deficient. There is something wrong with being feminine. Which is just wild if you think about it. Again, the goal of the feminist movement is for women to become men. But anyway, so what de Beauvoir does in this statement is articulate a categorical difference between biological sex and gender. And this is just how we think nowadays because it's become so ubiquitous, but this is radical. Gender, in her view, is a social construct formed by civilization or society. So, she's a French philosopher. She's a She's a student of the great intellectual, the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre. She sees herself as carrying on Sartre's legacy. But again, she also sees herself as part of the legacy of the other great French intellectuals, particularly Rousseau. So again, remember, Rousseau says that civilization is inherently corrupting on the self. Rousseau is sort of the first stepping stone on the journey to the rise and triumph of the modern self, that civilization inherently corrupts the self. And that's what de Beauvoir is saying too. That society and civilization is imposing gender upon people, and because it's society and civilization that's doing it, and society and civilization are inherently corrupting, that this artificially constructed gender norms must be inherently corrupting on people, and that's why we got to get rid of them. They're not real. They're artificial. They're created by society to promote the patriarchy and things like that. So think about something Truman said earlier about how people view the world, particularly as it relates to the theories of the social scientist. Truman and others argue that when a social scientist offers a new interpretation of how the world works, that new interpretation actually affects how people see the world. If the scientist says this is how the world works, now people believe this is how the world works, and they see it, whether it's true or not. For instance, if someone as authoritative as a scientist tells you that everything that people do is driven by sex, now people tend to think that everything that they do is driven by sex, and they start reading the world in terms of that. Before Beauvoir and her like-minded intellectuals come along, when it comes to human beings, talking about someone's sex was identical to talking about their gender. These two are the same things. We're just using two different terms for the same things. But now, because of people like...
Foundational work, The Second Sex, 1949.
Oh, my phone's trying to explain to me what we're talking about. It could probably explain it better than I could. But anyways, okay, so sex and gender used to be the same thing in the mind of practically everyone. But now, because of Beauvoir and her colleagues, people now see a fundamental difference between sex and gender. People look at the world as if there's a fundamental difference between sex and gender, even if there's not. They've imposed a certain view on reality that doesn't fit to reality, but they're dedicated to the system, no matter what the facts on the ground say, just like every other false worldview out there. Of course, and this is what they're going to point out, and they're going to say, well, this is profound, and this is really how people have always viewed it. But it's worth mentioning, there always has been a difference between grammatical gender that may or may not have anything to do with biological sex. And they're assuming, that the theorists are assuming for the most part, they're talking to dumb English speakers that don't know any other languages. So I need to explain this a little bit more because it's not obvious to us because of the way our language works. English used to be a gendered language. It used to have masculine and feminine and neuter case endings. That dropped off over 600 years ago. They're still preserved in certain things. We tend to refer to certain objects with either masculine or feminine pronouns. For instance, are ships masculine or feminine? Boats. They're feminine, right? And that's a convention in our language. Does that have anything to do with biological sex? No. Not in any direct way, at least. But in Romance languages, if not most languages, I'd have to look into that more, but at least for Romance languages, their entire language structure is gendered. You typically have masculine, feminine, and neuter cases, or in English, so for instance, he is masculine, she is feminine, and it is neuter. Neuter means neither. In Spanish, you say el sol and la luna. The sun, masculine, the moon, feminine, because grammatically the sun is male and the moon is female, but that has nothing to do with biological sex. And not all languages share the same gender conventions for objects. For instance, in German, the word for bridge is feminine. In Spanish, the word for bridge is masculine. And that does have an effect on the way we speak. You know, they've done studies with this. If you ask a German speaker to describe a bridge, a German speaker is much more likely to use feminine categories like the bridge is elegant or the bridge is beautiful, whereas a Spanish speaker is more likely to use more masculine categories to describe the bridge. A Spanish speaker is going to say that the bridge is robust, or the bridge is strong, or maybe even the bridge is handsome, and things like that, because of the way gender works grammatically in their language. And so you might be, you know, sort of the absurdity of where all this is going. You may be aware, I mean, you've all seen this before. In recent years, there's been a push made by American liberals to start calling Latinos Latinx. Because, you know, Latinos is grammatically masculine, and so Latinx is now a neuter term. Neither, it can apply to everybody equally. But because Latino, it's grammatically masculine, and the liberals think they need to liberate the language from masculine gender as part of taking down the patriarchy. That if you're using the term Latino, that's supporting the patriarchy because Latino is masculine. It's absurd. Again, they're making a false equivocation between grammatical gender and biological sex. That's not really how things work in practice. And everybody else who has a gendered language in the world fundamentally understands that, but you know, stupid Americans don't. 99.9% of Hispanics out there think it's absurd to be referred to as Latinx. They think that's stupid. They still call themselves Latinos because that's the correct form in their own language. Actually, it's been pointed out, it's actually a part of a colonial attitude for American liberals to impose a term upon another group. That's us thinking we know better than them, which is true. So it really wasn't until last year that most liberals in America and most liberal organizations dropped the term Latinx because none of the Latinos were using it. It was just white people calling Latinos Latinx, and that was beginning to be seen as really offensive and absurd. So the point is that even the liberal theorists don't understand how gender works, either grammatically or biologically, and how it relates, the two relate. If you think Mexicans referring to themselves in the masculine plural is sexist, then frankly, you're an idiot. And no one should take you seriously. That is absurd. And in fact, it's probably racist as well, because you're imposing your white liberal views upon people of a different ethnic group. I'm still, you know, to sort of illustrate the absurdity further, I'm still waiting for liberal groups, you know, they're trying to cleanse the language of gendered terminology. I'm still waiting for liberal groups to start pushing for equality when it comes to manhole covers for the sewers. Why not call them person holes or woman holes? Why do they have to be manholes? Isn't that sexist and supporting the patriarchy? They ought to be feminine too. They need to start a petition to fix this inequality in manholes. They're all manholes.
None of the feminists want a job that would require them to go down into a
Yeah. But again, you do see some feminist groups that they're pushing, more women need to enter certain fields that no women want to enter. A lot of men don't want to do either. But it's absurd, and we all know it's absurd when it comes to things like that, and we need to point out the absurdity. It's worth laughing at because it is laughable, and us pretending otherwise, that this is somehow a respectable intellectual position. It's not, and we don't need to pretend like that. We are doing injustice to truth and reason by treating this as reasonable. But anyways, de Beauvoir has made the leap to saying that biological sex has nothing to do with gender whatsoever, that a biological man can just as rightfully be called a her or a she as a biological woman, because in her view, gender is constructed socially and has nothing to do with biology. De Beauvoir thinks if she took a baby boy and raised the boy just like people have traditionally raised girls, then the result will be an adult male who behaves indistinguishably from an adult female. And so, as you may have guessed, like a lot of the intellectuals, de Beauvoir had no children of her own. Apparently she never observed children. She never observed the behavior of boys and girls, because even the most stupid of people with children understand that there's fundamental differences in the ways boys and girls behave that have absolutely nothing to do with how they're raised. But of her view of gender, Truman writes, to use the language of a later gender theorist, Judith Butler, gender is a performance, a set of behaviors that society has come to expect from those who possess a certain kind of body. In so doing, a separation is made between sex, biologically determined, and gender, socially constructed, that the latter floats free of any biological determination and can be made and remade at will. One is born biologically female. One becomes a woman by learning the performances required by society. And so at this point, we'll close the lesson this way. Is there anything to that whatsoever, that being a woman is something that's learned, and that there's certain things that society teaches in terms of how women ought to behave? Is there anything to that? Yes.
Being a woman of Proverbs is something that can be learned.
Yes, there are certain things that we teach and we instruct and that we culcate. Now again, our argument is, well, these things are suited to the gender or the sex. Again, I think these two things are intimately related and practically mean the same thing, or functionally mean the same thing. But there's certain things that we do that are more suited to us, but because of our biology, depending on whether we're male or they're female. That doesn't mean that a man or a woman can't do certain tasks that the other gender normally does. For instance, in the Bible, we see it's normative for men to wage war, and in fact, it's a crime, for a woman to put on a warrior's garment. Because that's defying her gender category in a way that's inappropriate. So it's normative for men to wage war, but at the same time, it's also commendable when Jael takes a tent peg and rams it through Sisera's skull, right? That's not normally her job. That shouldn't have had to be her job, but she's doing the right thing when she kills Sisera. Or, for the woman, Abimelech, the anti-judge Abimelech in the book of Judges, he's going around slaughtering people and razing cities. It's commendable for this woman in the city that he's besieging, for her to take a rock and throw it down from the tower and crush his head. Even though it's not normative for her to be fighting in war, there's certain things that necessitate us doing things that are outside of our norms. We all understand that, but we don't make the exceptions the rule. At the same time, it might be normative for women to take the lead with babies and homemaking. We would say it's more suited to their biology, especially when it pertains to babies. That's obvious, or it ought to be, at least to us. Not to other people today, but nonetheless, it is commendable at times for men to change diapers, or to feed the baby with a bottle, or to do things like wash dishes. You have not abandoned your masculinity by doing these things, or at least I hope that's what you all believe, right? There's things that we do that are outside the norms that are acceptable when the situation demands it. We are adaptable as human beings, but that does not mean that sex and gender are interchangeable or irrelevant. It is insane to argue that biology does not create real differences between males and females in terms of how they operate, and they typically operate in the world. But we do live in strange times. Truman writes, to move from this rather obvious reality to the notion that sex and gender are separable and that the latter is simply performance is a dramatic metaphysical leap, the plausibility of which depends upon a number of other prior factors. First, inner psychology must have been granted ultimate authority in human identity. Second, technology needs to have rendered the possibility of changing gender to be something that is technically plausible. Finally, the idea needed a powerful lobby group and an attractive media presence in order to help normalize the idea. The former came from its engrafting into the LGB movement. The latter in the person of Bruce, now Caitlyn Jenner. And so that's the lesson. And something that popped into my mind is, in terms of, being a woman, for de Beauvoir's view, is something that's learned, that's not inherent. Again, there are certain aspects of that. We would say, well, there's some truth in that. That's not the whole truth, but there are some things that, you teach and instruct girls and how to behave and grow up into women. But, I've heard this, and maybe you don't admit it now, but, maybe you've said something like this to your own daughters. Your daughter says, your 5-year-old says, I'm a woman. And I've heard well-meaning mothers respond, no, you're not. You haven't earned the right to be a woman. I don't think that's helpful. I think that's a reflection of the modern confusion of our language and categories that have worked its way into the social imagination. You're a girl, not a woman. I think it'd be more appropriate to say, you're a little woman. You haven't fully gotten there, but you're in the process of becoming everything that you're intended to be. But denying that girls are women, as well-meaning as that is for mothers to do, I don't think is helpful. Again, I think that's a reflection of category. You're a little woman. You're well on the way to becoming a woman, and you're part of that process.
And the same as the flip side.
Yes. You're not a man. You're a boy. You're a little man. You're well on the way. We're getting to the fullness of what it means to be a man. You may not be at the fullness yet, but you are in that category. And so I really, especially when it comes to boys, you look at, again, they're going to say, well, being gay is not a choice. This is just who you are. There are a lot of factors, and these boys' lives came together to make them think that they're gay. And some of it's the attitudes of their dads, attacking them for their masculinity. I've met people, and they say that's a big part of it. Yes, sir?
I was going to say, you kind of just touched on it, but I think the whole movement was legitimized when they started saying that they were born that way, as opposed to he's a sexual deviant, which is what they were always viewed as, or somebody failed that girl and now she's a lesbian. As soon as they started saying they were born that way, they allowed the trans to say the same thing.
Yeah.
But I also think it's legitimizing them further if we call them by their whole name too.
Yeah.
So I don't think we should refer to them as the LGBTQ plus society or group. I think we should.
Well, especially, we shouldn't refer to them by their preferred pronouns, right? At a bare minimum, because that's doing violence. Oh, if they give you some absurd name, that's the only thing you have. I mean, we could call them by their last names. That's an easy out for us. But at bare minimum, we shouldn't use their pronouns, because that'd be lying. We're bearing false witness if we're using pronouns that aren't true of their biology. That's disingenuous on our part. But yeah, certain things have happened. There has been an explosion in the amount of teens that identify as LGBT or queer. And a number of different factors. Bad parenting is a major part of that. Perhaps abusive parenting. I know a very, very high number of men who are gay that have talked about sexual abuse in their past. And the LGBT community gets outraged when you bring that up, but I think studies reflect that too. It's pornography is another impact. So it's the media, they're taking it in, is having an effect on their taste and their desires. Their schooling, bullying, there's a high correlation. You also have autism is highly correlated, and there's that again leads into social ostracism and bullying and other problems that want them to join another community where they feel belonged. But these are the sort of things that we need to recognize, and the sort of things we definitely don't want to participate in things or do things to our children that want to push them in a certain way, in the wrong direction. We want to affirm that they're men and women, they're boys and girls, and the process of becoming the fullness of what it means to be man and woman, made in the image of God. And I think a lot of conservatives do things that sabotage that process because they think it's somehow tough love. But anyways, let's close with a word of prayer. We're way over time. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this time this morning that you've given us to study and to try to understand the insanity of the modern ever-extending alphabet acronym and the problems that brings to society. Help us to have some understanding of how these things came to be so that we can provide an apologetic a response to help people show them a better way, to show them what it means to be male and female, and how these are actually good and noble categories, both of which to belong to, as what suits the biology which you have given to us. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen.